So my work focuses on the intersection of privacy and free speech and new technology. So I look at the ways that technology can be used to promote, but also quite obviously to harm our personal liberties. Looking at the ways that collection of information by companies can be used to limit people's freedoms, and especially where it winds up in the hands of governments. Looking at ways that law enforcement and national security agents directly collect information about people without democratic safeguards, without checks and balances, without limitations. Looking at the ways that free speech can be promoted on the internet and some of the concerns we have with new ways that people can speak and express themselves, and that those can be controlled by third parties in ways that didn't happen in the traditional sphere, but now suddenly it's not just the government, it's other players who can actually impact people's ability to express themselves. And how all of this plays together in ways that we can make sure that we promote technology and promote laws, promote uses that really allow civil liberties to flourish in the new world and not be limited by application of technology. And one of the things that we're really focused on is making sure that as these things come down the pipe, or even better yet, before they come down the pipe, we have real policies in place to make sure that whoever is acquiring these technologies, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's the NSA, even in some cases private parties, there's actually an understanding of what the implications are, what kind of safeguards are in place, how we're making sure that data from cameras is being used to track down traffic violations and not to track people who are going to gay bars. There are all sorts of really positive uses of these technologies, but if we don't talk about them first, if they're just implemented and data is collected and later we try to patch safeguards on, that tends to fail. So we really need to make sure there's a process in place so the community, the citizens at large really know what's going on and have input into how our government is using these kind of technologies. Edward Snowden has happened, and the thing I take from that is that in years past there have been privacy snafus with companies and with the government, and they've blown over quickly. But now this is, it's been going on for months and is still capturing the attention of the U.S. public, which says to me that the privacy is actually resonating with people, that they're becoming more aware of the implications of data being collected and falling into the wrong hands, and how boundless the government thinks its authority is to collect information about people. They're rejecting the idea that just because you're not collecting information about what I actually say, it means you're not collecting anything private. So I think there is momentum building for real change, hopefully at the federal level, but also we're seeing that in our local work as well, where people are much more likely to step up and say and challenge, for example, drone use in Oakland, in Alameda County. There was a meeting of the Alameda County Board of Supervisors, and they actually rejected the use of drones, partly because of pressure put on by the general public, saying, we're not comfortable with this technology being deployed without a really clear understanding of how it's going to be used, what the limitations are in place. So I think at different levels, we're really seeing something of a sea change where people have gone from, I don't know what's happening here, and maybe it's a threat to me, to, I see this is happening, I know this is being abused, I need to do something about it. I mean, I'm not terribly thrilled with the voting situation all the time either myself, but I think it really is useful for people to express themselves, and they can express themselves to politicians, and letters and emails and phone calls do have some impact. But one of the things that really works is talking to companies, because these companies are somewhat stuck in the middle. They're companies that were accused of being part of PRISM, for example, had to really push hard for the right to be transparent and say, look, we're not actually voluntarily giving information to the government. We have to under court orders. We'd like to tell you what happens, but they're telling us we can't. And now there's been pressure enough that they have at least a little bit of transparency around how many demands they get and how much information they respond to under even national security orders. And so when the companies are caught in between and they hear pressure from their users and they hear that their users don't trust them anymore and they're worried about their economic interests, they have a lot of leverage too. And when companies and individual citizens together put pressure on lawmakers, there's a lot more possibility for change than just one or the other acting independently. There certainly are companies that, there are reports that they have been having massive dumps of data to the NSA or to the government, of backdoors, of known requests for an entire 3 months worth of every single record of every single phone call going across a telecom carrier's network. They know that's happening. On the other hand, the fact that they're supposedly secure data streams between data centers are being tapped into, possibly fiber optic lines in the middle of the ocean. Some of them had been making progress towards securing that, but I don't think anyone was quite, at least I'm not aware of companies that were totally prepared for the scope of that. And to me, the surprise is not so much, personally speaking, there weren't too many revelations that were surprising independently, but the fact that everything was going on, the scope of data acquisition and surveillance, and even meddling with encryption standards that was happening, has been frightening. But to the extent what companies knew what, that's hard to say. I mean, one of the hard things here is that to the extent that we had any moral high ground, we've somewhat surrendered it now, and that that's maybe a negative consequence of the Snowden disclosure. Not to say that they haven't been an overall plus to have transparency, but now when we're complaining about Russia spying on journalists during the Olympics, it's harder to do when the NSA is, perceived as spying and on intercepting everything it possibly can get its hands on. So it makes it a little bit harder for us to differentiate ourselves from regimes that are not only collecting data but actually using it to repress people, which I don't think the U.S. government is generally doing. So I think that's a real harm that's come from this in the international scheme. There's also an economic consequence. There are countries who are encouraging people to keep your data at home in Germany and Brazil, elsewhere. Whether it's actually more secure there or not, unclear. They haven't had the leaks, but there's certainly plenty of evidence that many other countries are also collecting as much information as they can. But it's having an impact not just on U.S. companies, but on the idea that the internet is a global network. There's certainly now some pressure for countries and for companies to stop sharing data globally as much as they did and start being much more conservative with how it's shared, and that can really impact how the economics and the openness of the internet work. There have also been pushes to actually close down the internet in some ways. Fortunately, those don't seem to be going too far, but those are certainly frightening from the innovation aspect of the internet as an open network going to the internet of a balkanized world of different national networks with different protocols and different security and not nearly as much sharing and transparency. The short version is that if the NSA is interested in you personally, encryption will not save the day. They are, unless you are able to flee to the Moscow airport or otherwise escape their physical jurisdiction, they will be able to monitor your phone calls. Maybe you have a completely separate computer that never talks to the internet. Maybe that's safe, but what are you going to do with it these days? But in the broader scheme of things, no, I think encryption does help because it changes the assumption from everything is fair game to everything is actually secure. It makes it harder. It makes this bulk metadata collection or bulk data collection much, much less feasible. And that to me is a good thing because it changes the assumption that, sure, if it's all open, it should be fair game to, okay, it's being closed. People actually want it to be private. They're showing by using encryption, by companies offering encryption, by doing more things to secure data, that the expectation of the American people is that our communications are private and they're not fair game to the government and they're not fair game to the ISPs and they're not fair game to anyone who just happens to have a tap on our line. And that can change, maybe that builds up and percolates through the legal system, but it also has real practical effects on whether or not you can collect a massive set of data to mine for who knows what purpose. There's really not some magical distinction between the words we say and all this other data about us. We heard Obama say, don't worry, we're not listening to your phone calls. But there's more and more evidence that metadata or any kind of data can be extremely invasive and extremely sensitive. I mean, that's what is driving the internet economy is targeted advertising, which is based on not the words you say in your emails, but tracking your actions, which websites you visit, which things you do. And that can expose, that can be useful for advertising, but it can also expose incredibly sensitive information about people. You can expose sexuality, you can expose pregnancy, you can expose all sorts of very sensitive things about individuals. And if the government is simply keeping a massive database of this kind of information, it doesn't make me feel any safer when they say, well, but we're not actually recording your phone calls or listening in on your emails. So I think that's a real recognition that data in general is valuable but also extremely sensitive. And I think that's one of the positives that's coming out of this whole experience is we're starting to rethink how do we relate to our own data? How does information about us, how can it be used to influence us? Not just to expose secrets, but to affect what ads we see, to affect what sites we're driven to change our perception of the world in ways that we don't even know is happening. And I think that's really going to be a broader societal conversation, even beyond the scope of surveillance going forward. And I think this has probably helped to catalyze that a little bit. The idea of broadening access to healthcare is great. And the idea of using data to help inform people and inform healthcare providers is great. But the danger is that you only focus on, well, if you put all the data together, maybe we can figure something out, and not on what else is going to happen when we marry, as you said, financial data and medical information are two incredibly sensitive forms of information. You put those together, and if it's not secured, if you don't have auditing to make sure that it's only being used for the appropriate purposes, all sorts of harm can happen. And so if we're not really thinking about the consequences of the data we're collecting and how we're putting it together and who we're letting access it and how long we're keeping it, all these really essential questions that need to be asked before we put the data together and assemble a database, it's a real threat. There's a Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which has recently been convened. It's nominally existed for several years, but it was finally filled last year. And part of their job is to oversee some of the federal government's activities and look for instances where they might be encroaching on personal privacy, on freedom of expression, on other civil liberties in ways that they didn't anticipate. There are also the Government Accountability Office and other internal watchdogs within the government. But the biggest point is that this needs to be more transparent, because it shouldn't be the government watching out for the government's excesses. It should be the people able to watch out for the government's excesses. And if we don't have the transparency to really know what programs are going on, to understand how the data is being collected and who it's being shared with, and whether government agencies are siloing it or putting it in one big pot somewhere, are they handling it themselves, are there third parties, what kind of real security is around it? Not to say that every single person is going to understand that, but if you expose that to the general public, then people who really do understand the nuances of security, of encryption, of privacy, can help inform the debate in a way that doesn't happen if it's just the government saying, trust us, we've got it all under control. When corporations are collecting incredible amounts of information about individuals, there's the same kind of accountability problem where you don't know what information a company knows about you, who it's been shared with, what it's been used for, how long it's been kept, whether when you ask them to delete it, if they actually did or not. So we've also been pushing for more transparency on the corporate level, because again, corporations can't put you in jail, but they can do a lot of other things to influence your life, including possibly share that information with the government. So I think in terms of managing information and making sure that people are able to control their own data, bringing companies into this equation is certainly essential. At the moment, it's very hard. I mean, the FTC has some ability to censor organizations that overstep their privacy policies, but very little authority to go into any random organization and say, show us what data you're doing, to actually investigate their practices. So usually what happens is something comes to light through some harm, then there's an enforcement capability, but there's not a lot of transparency before the fact. And we would like to see more transparency, more ability for anyone from common citizens to research groups and academics to the government be able to audit and examine how companies are treating data, what they're collecting, how they're analyzing it, and what they're doing with it, so that people can prevent privacy harms instead of simply try to remedy them. Because when information about you is exposed, there's no putting the cat back in the bag. I don't think the solution is to appoint someone to do all of this. The ecosystem of data online is too broad. The reality is what we need is a ecosystem where it's transparent, so that individuals are empowered, and other companies. If you have a transparent ecosystem, there are companies who are going to invest in mining my data for profit. There will also be companies who will invest in building me tools so that I can evaluate my options. Because if I'll buy a tool that allows me to choose which company to use, then the ecosystem can balance out, because the information is available to everyone. The problem right now is that the information is only available on one side, and the consumer side doesn't have as much access, and then they can't make informed decisions. And I think it really has to be the market and the consumers making informed decisions and being able to enforce this, but they can't do that without transparency. But I'm not sure I would say that there should be any one government agency or other individual, me or anyone else, who is empowered to make real choices about what you can or can't do. You just have to be transparent. Not to say there aren't some limitations on what you can and can't do. You can't blackmail me with my information. You can't breach a contract. But generally speaking, we need the transparency so that people can make their own decisions about what trade-offs they're comfortable with. What are they actually getting when they sell their data to a company? Because you don't get products for free on the internet. You trade your data for them, generally speaking.